Welcome to the Have More Fun podcast. In this episode, I talk with David Thomas about what men wish they could tell women, tips for parenting boys so they grow up to be wise, brave, and kind, and also how to harness masculinity in all the best ways.
We sound like we have defective brains when I say all this as males. We don't.
When do you catch up?
We don't.
When does it all
but we just develop at a different pace.
Okay.
If you came home with me, there is at least a note card in every room where my boys function. The bathroom, the bedroom, the kitchen, and I'm not even going to have a whole sentence. I'm going to have it down to like 3 words. I'm here to remind you, nowhere in this country is a mother-son dormitory. Like, he's got to go away by himself.
My husband Joe is a big fan of a guy named Garrett White. Garrett leads an organization called Wake Up Warrior, where he and his team are helping men be the most whole version of themselves. And his message resonates so deeply with a lot of the dudes in my life. Not long ago, I read a piece Garrett wrote about how the current state of manhood is a direct result of the shared experiences of our culture 2 generations ago. And it's so fascinating, I just had to share it with you. Here's what he says. By the time World War II erupted, it was the second major world war to hit our nation. And why is this important? Because a majority of boys were growing up with absent fathers and then enlisting into the military as teenagers, which meant a new definition of a man started to rear its ugly head. He then asked the question, what's not allowed in the military? And of course, the response is feelings. He says there's no room for feelings or emotions in the middle of war. There's no time for it. Everything is based on manning the F up and accomplishing his mission. And those are his words, not mine, so don't send me any emails about it. He then goes on to explain that this militarized man culture says if something is bothering you, bury it and move on. Which makes total sense inside the framework of war. But the problem was that's not something you can just turn on and off like a faucet. And Garrett argues that men came home and continued that pattern of emotional suppression, which he argues is why we had a generation of men who were disconnected from their families. Their work lives were shaped by factory culture, where thinking big and innovatively is frowned upon. And due to the back-to-back wars, a new philosophy gets adopted where showing emotions and feelings makes you weak. So the more you bury, the more respect and praise you got. Garrett goes on to argue that the result was men who were dull, disconnected, sedated, suppressed, and empty. But the damage from the wars wasn't isolated to the experience of only men. Women were thrown into the workforce to replace all the men that were off fighting the wars, and they were still expected to take care of the kids, household, and everything else imaginable. And they did it all, without missing a beat. For over a decade, women held down the country, raised a generation of kids solely on their own, worked full-time while also supporting the war effort, all while putting dinner on the table and running a house. Garrett hypothesizes that this dynamic brought in the element of confusion to men, where they didn't know what to do when the war was over. They're already disconnected from their families, suppressing and sedating all their emotions, and now they're being told that they're kind of needed, but not really. And I have to tell you, as I share these words, there's some of this that doesn't make sense to me, but the men in my life who have read it all assure me that this is entirely accurate. And further along in this article, Garrett goes on to talk about how women went on to gain rights, which clearly is an obvious choice. But he shares that the message of we are equal was heard by men as we are the same, which added to the confusion of how men understand their worth and roles. And so the argument is that this is why we are living in a culture where we have 40 to 50-year-old men who still act like 12-year-old boys, because they're more confused than ever about what being a man is. They're wrong if they do it one way, but they're also wrong if they do it the other. And meanwhile, women are sick of having men who don't know how to show up for them. And as a result, men are spiraling out of control, sedating, suppressing, and using positional power to oppress women sexually and verbally. Ultimately, his whole entire point is that it's time we make a shift as a society and reset the expectations and standards on what it looks like to be a man. Which is what we're going to talk about right now. In this episode, I called in my husband, Joe, to join me in a conversation with David Thomas about the current state of manhood and how being a man is about knowing that masculinity isn't about power. It's about honor and virtue, both of which are cultivated and earned. And that's why my guest, author and speaker David Thomas, is one of my favorites. He's the director of family counseling at Daystar Counseling in Nashville, Tennessee. And he's also the author of 8 books, including best-selling Wild Things, The Art of Nurturing Boys. He's a frequent guest on national television and podcasts, has been featured in publications like USA Today, and he recently completed his newest book called Are My Kids on Track? The 12 emotional, social, and spiritual milestones your child needs to reach. And what I love about David is he is one of the most genuine and thoughtful people you will ever meet. He exudes kindness and is the kind of guy that you want to hang out with on a daily basis. The way he is helping parents reimagine the ways we are raising boys is transforming families, and I couldn't be a bigger fan. And so without further ado, here is David Thomas. Okay, David, I have been looking forward to this conversation for weeks now, especially in light of what is going on in our culture. And it seems to me like men are under the microscope right now in a really weird way. We have a staggering amount of men who are being confronted about behavior that's deeply wounded women. And for many years, the narrative was boys will be boys, and that was just kind of the green light to not talk about it. And then at the same time, obviously I work for an organization where we interact with hundreds of thousands of women over the course of a year. And I'm hearing that women want their men to be great listeners and brave and protective and providers and like all of these descriptive things that we want from our men. And it seems like we have such high standards that can any man even live into this in a really healthy way? And the weird thing that we're hearing, I know I'm asking you like a million questions all at once, but we are hearing more than we ever have a narrative shift where women are saying that they have a much higher sex drive than their partner, which is a huge shift from what we've heard over the past 40 years that we've been in existence as an organization. So it's like all these things are coming together. And I guess my question is, how do we help the men in our lives be the best versions of themselves? And also, how do we help our boys navigate our current cultural climate?
It's a great
Just a million questions all at once. So you can take the next 30 minutes to unpack it.
They are great and important questions. And thank you for even inviting me into conversation around this, because clearly we share a passion that we could play a role in some way of raising up a generation of boys and young men where it looks different than what we're seeing. And you're right, it is an incredibly complicated and important time in history. And as a result of that, with everything happening in our culture right now, everything that's in the news, I think it's a harder time than ever for boys to identify role models. It's harder for them. I think it's harder for us to cast a vision for them of what healthy masculinity looks like. So I'm thrilled that you would invite me into a conversation about that. And I would say in response to some of those questions, I'm elated. I'm thrilled that we're moving toward retiring boys will be boys. Clearly, I don't think that has served men or women well. And I think I'm excited for us to think about new ways, again, to define and call boys into healthy masculinity. And I hope that women don't compromise in their desire for men to be noble and to have integrity and to be great listeners, all of those things. And I don't think that's asking too much. I really don't. And I think there's a lot we are doing. There's a lot of good still happening, and a lot we can be doing to raise boys who can grow into becoming those kind of men. And I just spent time in really rich conversation here at MOPS talking about the role that moms play in that and how they shape so much of who boys are and the men that they're becoming. And I love any opportunity I'm given to talk about that, because we, in my opinion, have the most conversation around the role that we as fathers play, which is of great importance and vital, the men and the boys' lives. But I think it's oftentimes dismissing the significance of a mom's role. So I'm just honored that you would invite me here into this space and to have those kind of conversations.
Totally. So as our boys are coming across the stories in the news and hearing about men who have had really bad behavior over the past 20, 30, 40 years,
how do we begin to have a redemptive conversation about it?
I would say a couple of things come to mind. One, I think the tendency can be for us as parents to maybe just shut the news off. And I would challenge parents not to do that. Don't shut it off altogether. Definitely limit, because there's just a lot of garbage out there that I don't really want it to land on me. I certainly don't want it to land on my children. But I would say use the stories. Use the stories on the news. Use the stories in print as a vehicle for critical thinking. And I think to even celebrate with our sons and our daughters. I had this conversation last week with my 3 adolescents to say, as saddened as I am by what I'm hearing about men in power in our world right now, I'm thrilled that men who are abusing their power or using their power for the harm of women are being called out. I'm thrilled that's happening. Nothing about that is good for our culture. Nothing about that is godly. Nothing about that is the way we were designed to be as men and women. So I'm grateful, and I hope it continues to happen. And so to use those kinds of stories and conversations as a vehicle for critical thinking, and to begin to say, okay, there's a lot of really lousy examples out there of males. Where do you see evidence of healthy masculinity? Asking that question to my daughter, asking that question to my sons. And certainly a lot of boys, so many boys are going to be drawn to charismatic, athletic men in our culture, and that's so common, and it's getting harder and harder to identify those who have integrity. So, I'm so thankful. I challenge so many boys to read Drew Brees' book or to read R.A. Dickey's book. Just there are great men in that arena, men who play professionally and who love their wives and who love their children and who are all about doing good in this world. And so I'm thankful, and I think we can still find it. We just have to work a little bit harder. But again, those kinds of conversations help our kids to begin to connect some dots for themselves rather than us just connecting dots for them.
That's good.
Last night you were having that conversation with our kids. There were a bunch of fires down in Southern California in the little tiny town where we moved out here from. And you've said this a lot in our family is, in the midst of disaster or chaos, was it Mr. Rogers that said, look for the helpers? And so it's really akin to that. These are newsworthy things. They're men who are abusing their power. They're men who are doing things that they shouldn't be doing. And so, that's newsworthy. But equally as newsworthy, but not as sensational, are the good men who are just doing good things. And so you have to look for them. You have to pay attention to seeking that out. So I think that's great.
Yeah.
What would you guys say about the narrative that I'm hearing a lot about the emasculation of men in our culture by women? Any thoughts in general?
You want to go first?
Yeah, I heard there was a guy who I follow who I think the world of him. I don't think he's for everybody, but he talked about this a lot. There was the feminist movement, which was really actually for what it was designed for, needed. Right? Women couldn't vote. There were things that women couldn't do from a societal standpoint. So he said there's been this pendulum swing, though, so far to the other side that it's created an unhealthy balance. And I think there is the emasculation of men. I think you see it everywhere. I mean, there's all kinds of examples of that. And so finding the healthy example of what it means to be a man, not the opposite side of the pendulum, to even out that. It's where is the middle ground where there's good, healthy relationship internally for a man, which I think, again, a lot of that comes, I've seen a lot of that come from mothers, right? Mothers speaking into their sons as fans of their sons that create a good, healthy viewpoint of their life. And then them playing that out, not the bravado, like I'm beating my chest and trying to prove something. It's not about that. That, I think, is on the other side of the pendulum that I would say is more unhealthy.
Mm-hmm. And I would add to that, I think it's, here's something redemptive that's coming from the conversation happening culturally. I think it's driving more and more conversation, obviously, around gender, around what it means to be masculine and feminine, but I think also what does it mean to be for each other? In fact, I can remember, I will just simply confess this for me, I was in undergrad back in the 80s, was the first time a professor challenged me on the idea that a man could be a feminist and redefining what that means. That, he said, what that means for me is that I'm for women. And I remember thinking, me too. Yeah, me too. I'm for
Yeah.
women. I'm a husband. My firstborn is a daughter. I'm so for women. And so what does it look like for me to raise sons who are feminists, who are for women? And what does it look like, going back to pointing to men, healthy men, what does it look like to talk with our boys and our girls about the fact that I believe Jesus was a man who was for women. There is evidence all throughout Scripture of how much he valued women and children. And so what does it look like to look at that as an example of healthy masculinity, a man who was for women, a man who was a servant leader, a man who had integrity, a man who had restraint? I mean, there's so much evidence of what I want my boys to be about in that example of healthy masculinity that, again, we can then connect the dots to where do you see any evidence of that in other men in our culture? Where do you not see evidence? What does it look like to move more toward that at this point? But to raise up a generation of boys who are very for women and who understand the concept of male privilege and how can I use my presence and my power and my privilege for good in this world and for women.
So good.
I think a good example of that is the concept of opening up a door for women, which previously was viewed as a chivalrous thing to do. It became, so the opposite side of this pendulum said, well, that means that you think women are weak and can't open the door for themselves. That has nothing to do with it.
Right.
It's that healthy side of, I'm not doing this because I think any less of you. I'm doing this to honor you and that sort of thing. So I think that's the how do we redeem, sometimes even just redeeming the language.
Absolutely.
Right? So what it means to be a feminist today is very different than what it meant when it was, first kind of proliferated. And so I think redeeming some of those things is an important role that we have to play, but it's also scary sometimes, I think, to speak out about that.
I agree.
And there's, these just massive viewpoints that just like instantly want to, harp on people who speak that way.
Yes.
So I think it's an interesting time right now, I think, around this conversation.
It is. Well, and I think it's equally important, how do we raise daughters who are for men, for healthy masculinity? Like, how can we be more for each other right now?
That's really good. What are some tips for that?
I think definitely it's using a lot of the junk and figuring out, I love even the way you asked that question, just how can we make it redemptive? How can we find value? How can we create a context for our kids to make connections in a certain way? And that's not always as easy, but I think even we were talking about, the three of us, about raising adolescents, like I'm all about using everything that's right in front of us. In music, where do you see evidence of, in music, men who are for women, women who are for men? Where do you see it in film? Where do you see it in the books you're reading? And so, drives home from a movie we're seeing as a family, or a conversation we're having with our kids about a book they're required to read in school. So I think use anything and everything that's right there in front of you as the starting point, because with kids and adolescents, it's just where their interest lies. It's what their world is right now.
That's so good. Okay, let's talk a little bit about parenting, and in particular, parenting boys. You are masterful. You are leading the way in helping all of us parents raise our young men. And so are there like 3 things that in your mind you're like, man, if parents just knew these 3 things about raising boys, it would revolutionize how they view parenting and interacting with their young guys, and it would change the entire future if we knew these 3 things?
Great question. I'm thinking of about 10. I'm going to get it down to 3. I would say first and foremost, if we remembered, I think we know this, but if we remembered that the boy brain is completely different than the girl brain. And I just got through actually talking about that some in the video series of just, the female brain from the earliest moment secretes more serotonin, which is directly related to impulse control. So our girls have advanced abilities to regulate their bodies, their words, their emotions, all these things. And then I go on to talk about the frontal lobe. The little girl's frontal lobe grows at an earlier stage and is generally more active, and that, affects our executive decisions. And so even there, like remembering she has advanced abilities. So we want to set the bar at a place, first and foremost, that is reasonable, so he can meet the expectations. And we've got to adjust the bar. If our firstborn's a girl, we've got to adjust the bar because his developmental pace will just look different than hers. So I would say that's a starting point. Jumping from there, I would think about the way he learns. Boys are primarily tactile, kinesthetic, visual, spatial, and experiential learners. Now, did you notice nowhere in that list is auditory? So, quick to remind parents, moms especially, the easiest trap I think any of us can step into is talking at him, talking to him way too much, and that information kind of flying over him. So, I would say, with that in mind, we are, as males, more of the Boy Brain 101 information is that the occipital lobe grows at an earlier stage. Its development is more rapid for girls, and that's what informs you all's ability as women to take in more sensory data. In addition to that, your hippocampus is larger. We sound like we have defective brains when I say all this as males. We don't.
When do you catch up?
We don't.
When does it all
but we just develop at a different pace.
Okay, all right.
And as a result of that, women have that remarkable ability that I'd give anything to have to multitask. Now, some men can do more of that, but generally speaking, we're more singularly focused creatures. So therein is a great opportunity when your sons come home from school every day and you're thinking about all the things he needs to do, from homework to dinner, the nighttime ritual, taking a shower, all those things. We want to break it all down into manageable tasks for him. So we don't want to be shouting 4 instructions across the room at him. He's going to get lost in that, or he's going to easily miss 2 or maybe 3 of those because we're bombarding him with information. So there, I would also challenge parents, use as many visual cues as possible. If you came home with me, there is at least a note card in every room where my boys function. The bathroom, the bedroom, the kitchen, and I'm not even going to have a whole sentence. I'm going to have it down to like 3 words, or a phrase.
Flush.
Make bed.
Flush.
There it is. And so that I don't have to be constantly nagging, prompting, redirecting. I just don't want to I don't want my relationship with them to be defined by that. So how can I give them some visual cues? And then I would also say to parents, a third thing is technology is here to stay. It's a part of our kids' life. I wish it weren't so much. It is. There are a lot of great things that accompany that. I would say thirdly, because it's so much a part of our kids' lives, figure out where you can use that both to his advantage and to your advantage. So, for example, we're going to be packing in a couple of weeks to go see family for Christmas, and I'm going to send my sons a PDF, a packing list, so that I don't have to be yelling upstairs, did you pack your belt for church? Do you have the button-down shirt? All these instructions, again, where I'm just bombarding him with a lot of words and verbiage. But, hey, buddy, I sent you a PDF with the stuff you need to make sure you've got before we board the plane, and giving him a lot of ownership in that. And then can I throw one more in?
Yes, please.
I would say if I were going to add one more to the list, I am such a believer in anything we can do as parents to move the boys we love toward a sense of purpose. And this even connects back to your important question about where we are culturally. I just want boys to be moving more and more toward a healthy sense of purpose. I think it's something we crave as males all throughout our lives. I think we want to feel like we have something to offer the world. We want to feel like the things we do with our hands matters. And so here we are in the holiday season as we're having this conversation, like, anything you can do as a family that involves him, no matter how young your son is, serving alongside you, going to a soup kitchen, packing a box of food, adopting a kid through compassion or world vision, anything you can do where he sees evidence of, I have purpose, what we just did as a family that I was a part of matters to someone else in this world. That's another beginning ingredient of connecting boys to a sense of healthy masculinity, using their power for good.
What would you say are the biggest pitfalls that moms tend to fall in with boys? Is it the over-communicating? Are there any others?
I would definitely say over-communicating is the biggest one. It would just too much verbiage, too much talk. I think we sound so much like Charlie Brown's teacher to him throughout his life. Wah, wah, wah. I would say beyond that, and I say this with the greatest of respect to moms, but I think over-involvement is another trap. I think there is, and I'd be curious to see if you all think this is true or not, but I think there is something I find that happens often, not always, but often for moms of daughters and for dads with our sons, is that we can be a little bit harder as fathers on our sons because we know what it takes to be a man in this world. And I think moms can do the same with daughters. You can be a little harder because you know what it takes to be a woman in this world. And the opposite gendered relationship then happens the opposite way. So we coddle our daughters a little too much as dads, and I think moms can do that with sons, become coddling or over involved sometimes in his life. And the long goal as a mom of a boy is to train him to be an independent person, an independent learner, an independent man, all these things. So I would challenge moms to say over-involvement, if you have an elementary age son, is think about even where you are when he does homework. If he walks in, unzips his backpack, puts his books on the kitchen table, and you immediately pull up a chair next to him, we're sending some kind of message to him there. In fact, I laugh with moms when I use that example sometimes, and we'll say, keep in mind, I travel around the country, and I'm here to remind you, nowhere in this country is a mother-son dormitory. Like, he's got to go away by himself. You can't be there for homework at that point. So thinking about every aspect of his life now with laundry. Are you moving him toward, if he's elementary age, putting clean clothes away? Actually, even toddler age boys can put clean shirts in a drawer that he can reach. And adolescent boys can do their own laundry. Elementary age boys can make a peanut butter and jelly sandwich for their lunch and pack that in a lunchbox. So what are the different steps that you're taking that move you away from that over-involvement and move him toward more independence?
So good. Have you ever watched the TV show The Goldbergs?
Yes.
Oh my gosh.
Love it.
That is
Love
exactly
it.
what we're trying to avoid. Although it is
There it
freaking
is.
hilarious.
It's hilarious.
Yeah.
But you're exactly right.
Oh my gosh, I love that show so much.
I'm actually a couple of things. It's really interesting societally right now. I was just watching a video on this the other day, talking about sex and gender. Sex being a biological function, gender being a choice that you have. And I just thought, man, there are so many things that are getting very blurry. Very blurry. And this is what's being taught, and this is what's being advocated for. And so it's interesting to hear you talk about the way that the brain is developed as there are boys and there are girls and they're different. And if we're trying to meld it all into one, how many times do I say, did you hear what I said to Joseph? And it's no, he didn't hear. All he heard was wah, wah, wah. He heard the first thing and then wah, wah, wah. And so it's really fascinating, I think, from a tip standpoint, just to be aware there's a difference and it matters.
Yeah,
it's not like it's just there's a difference. There's a difference and it matters how you play that out.
I agree, and it's all about how can I better work in tandem with the unique way that he's hardwired and the unique way that she is. I want to be operating in tandem with that, not against that. So even the ways I'm talking to him, talking with him, engaging. I just talked on the video series about when we have conversation with boys, appeal to all of his senses. So have your hand on his shoulder, say his name first to kind of call his attention back to the conversation. I mean, my sons are 15, my twin boys are 15, and when I have important conversations with them, I have my hand around the back of their neck. Hey, buddy, I'm that close and in close proximity, again, because I know it's what helps call that boy brain into the conversation in a different way. I don't have to engage my daughter in the exact same way. I could shout 5 instructions across the room with her, and she would nail every one of them. It's amazing because, as we were discussing, she can take in more sensory data. Yeah.
So good. So helpful as a mom. Man, I have so many questions for you. Let's talk about technology for a second. Okay, so the men in my life, one of them sitting right here to my right, and my son, occasionally get very drawn in to win a war or a battle or a competition on a video game that's very motivating and driving to them. And in my mind, I'm these are fake wars. What's the drive here? Is there a difference between men and women when it comes to technology and winning and that? Does it come back to the purpose? Is there anything related there?
I think it absolutely comes back to the purpose. And yes, I think those differences are strong. And I'm going to speak generally. Clearly, we know there are plenty of females who love and play video games. There are plenty of males who that's not as much their thing. But generally speaking, I do think we're more drawn into that arena. And I think as it connects to purpose, we love a battle to fight as men. We crave adventure. And I think men experience that even in those battles that we know aren't real. I think it also appeals to two more parts of us. I think the visual part we talked about a few minutes ago, we're just so visually stimulated. And, images on a screen capture captivate, capture us way differently than words on a page. So it's why so many men are drawn to that, and women may love more reading. Although, again, clearly there are men who love reading as well. I do. But it is to say, I think the other thing is competition. I think there's something about the winning element of that we are highly competitive creatures, and it feeds that part of us. It's interesting to me in my work as a therapist working with adolescents to even see the differences in the way they engage social media unique to gender. Generally speaking, my colleagues who work with adolescent girls would say they're more drawn into Instagram, which I think is a very relational feel. It's pictures, it's people, it's warmth, it's a lot of things. A lot of adolescent boys are more into Twitter still because it's more information, it's data, it's sports statistics. And that's not to say males don't like Instagram and females don't use Twitter, but it is to say I think that's even an example of where technology affects us differently, or we're drawn to it in different ways. So I think, because you as females, generally speaking, are very relationally driven, I think a lot of times women are not only or often going to engage technology if it accomplishes some of that for them, where it can accomplish a lot of things for us as males.
Fascinating. What about the pornography issue? I mean, we are giving our little boys like dynamite in their hands, I feel like, with iPads and phones, and it's so accessible in a way that it wasn't even 20 years ago.
Yes.
Even less. What tips do you have for us parents as we navigate that whole conversation?
Yeah, I would say a couple of things. One, because it is so accessible, and you're right, 20 years ago, a boy would have to work pretty hard.
Harder, right?
You did. You had to work hard to convince a guy in a convenience market to sell you a magazine that had only a handful of images in it. And
my
now
friend
a boy,
Katie, her parents had the Joy of Sex book, right? And so we're like looking through these hand-drawn images.
There it
and
is.
It's like, and that was super.
and that was, sure.
Yeah, risque.
That was
and
scandalous,
exciting. Yeah,
yes.
it was.
But now a boy can sit in his bedroom with a device in front of him and have access to thousands of images, terrifying, scary, destructive content. And so I think it's where the first and most important thing we do as parents is just put good safeguards on all devices that our kids get. And I really want us to talk openly about that with kids when they get their first device, whether that's their first iPod Touch, first iPad, first iPhone. I don't want that to be something that we do behind their back, but I'm a real advocate of talk openly. Just say, hey, I want to let you know we have this on our network. We put this accountability software on your device. I will be checking your text history. All of those kinds of things I think are important conversations that in doing so, we're being open and we're modeling accountability as a healthy way to live as a male and a female for that matter. I remember saying to my kids, this is on my device. Your mother could look at my history, internet history at any given moment if she wanted to, and that's a good way to live for all of us. And so I think we start there. It also beckons back to that statement I made a little bit earlier about from the get-go, girls have advanced abilities to regulate themselves. And so a boy can't regulate himself in terms of time with a video game in a way that a girl could. Like a female would arrive at a moment of thinking, you know what, I've been on this too long. My brain's kind of turned to mush. I should turn this off. Not so for a boy. So, having like the Disney product, the Circle component on your devices that just kind of shuts a device down at a certain point. Like game time ends at this point. Your iPad goes off at this point. I think that's really good with younger kids. And then I think as they graduate into adolescence, and again, we're kind of training them toward that independence, that we loosen the reins, but we still have a lot of those things intact. I have teenage boys I've worked with who go away to college who will set some kind of accountability software on all their devices where an email goes to a buddy of theirs at a different school just because they know I don't need to be alone in my dorm room with the internet. Yeah. And I'm like, that's fantastic that, again, we've had that training ground in place to where that was always familiar. We've been talking openly about it, and all of that is there.
Do you have favorite tools that you would recommend for that?
We have a blog. Raising Boys and Girls is our website, and we do what we call Technology Tuesday, and we have done several on some of our favorite monitoring software. Okay, and so I would say that might be the quickest way to get to, and even kind of compare and contrast it, which are more expensive, which are cheaper, which work better with Apple products, which work better with PCs. So yes, I'd say jump on Raising Boys and Girls for some good information. We also put, with the holidays coming around, we put some sample contracts on there. So if you're giving your kid their first iPad, it can say, we've got a contract that says, congratulations on your new iPad. here's the way it works responsibly. This is what happens if you use it irresponsibly,
So
without
smart.
responsibility.
That's awesome.
So I was having this conversation probably a few weeks ago or a month ago with somebody, and we were talking about how much leash do you give on devices like that? And there seem to be different camps. One is hold the reins very tightly, or I should say the leash closer to keep the analogy the same, but hold it closer because the more stringent you are, the less they'll be exposed to potentially, or you have a greater risk with a longer leash. But the longer leash, they will be able to develop their own controls and that sort of thing internally. And there are psychologists on both sides, behavioral psychologists, all this. And my comment was, I think they have no flipping clue. Like, it hasn't been out long enough to really know.
Not even having the internal tools to regulate yourself.
Right.
So we're like saying, regulate yourself. We're giving you a chance, but then you don't even have
That is it.
the tools.
It's for me always back to the brain. Like if I look at the way this creature's brain is put together, I acknowledge he can't regulate himself in those same ways that my daughter could. And so I have to put limits around the amount of time he's on the Xbox or some kind of gaming system, because he sit for hours. I had a mom in my office recently who said, David, I walked in a room on a Saturday and his legs were like crossed over. He clearly needed to go to the bathroom and relieve himself and wasn't even listening to his body signal him. And I'm like, of course, there's a boy. And so I think that's a part of why. But I think in response to your question, it really is always about letting the rope out. It is, in my mind, always about that long runway of preparing them for adulthood. And so there has to be what I call this training wheels approach, where we start with a training wheels bike, and then we take the training wheels off, and then it's moving toward a 10-speed, and then it's moving toward, think about the way we even approach driving in this country. There's such wisdom to that. Like, you got to spend a whole year with your permit in the car with your parents driving, and they're giving you feedback and input and observing how you're doing, and then you get a license. But even then, it's not like we send you out to drive 3 states away. Even then, it's like, okay, we're going to practice in the city. Do well with that, we'll take on the interstates. There's this progression that's there, and I think to handle technology in some of those same ways. And knowing that some kids, based on their hardwiring and their temperament, are just going to take off and handle that with a lot of responsibility and wisdom and discernment, and other kids are going to be more clumsy in that process. So just because you can get a driver's license at 16 doesn't mean all kids are ready. So it's knowing each of your kids individually.
And I think I read somewhere that you wrote, when things do happen, not to freak out about it.
Yes.
How do we respond in a healthy way? Where it's like, okay, we're learning. We're going to navigate this without a lot of shame or guilt.
In fact, connecting back to your question about pornography, I am quick to say to parents, if you discover that a boy you love has had some exposure to internet pornography, I would highly recommend you don't go talk to him right then. I would, because I think we're vulnerable to reacting more than responding in that moment. Give yourself some time and space, to grieve the loss of innocence, to have a conversation with your spouse or a trusted friend, to, think about what's a reasonable consequence. We're vulnerable, and, we go right into the room in those moments of saying, you're grounded from the internet for life, instead of saying a reasonable amount of time. But I think the key thing is what you asked within that question. I think we're most vulnerable to shaming him in that moment rather than honoring his curiosity. In fact, I would say at any point, if you discover a child you love, a boy you love has had exposure, I would begin that conversation with, I understand why you're curious. That makes so much sense to me. Of course you are. Of course you are. And there are some really helpful, healthy ways to honor that curiosity and some really destructive ways. And going to the internet with your questions, with your curiosity is a really dangerous practice. And so I think beginning there is so foundational, but I think it's hard for us to say it in that way and to say those kinds of things if we go straight in rather than giving ourselves some time to not react.
Good. I have been guilty of that before. Okay, there was a line that really struck me. Is Wild Things your most recent book?
My most recent book is a book called Are My Kids on Track? That's
Okay.
about emotional, social, and spiritual milestones. But Wild Things is the book on boys.
Okay. So there's a line in there, and it says that the older a boy is, the more he needs from his caregivers. Explain a little bit.
Sounds backwards, doesn't it? It really does. I think a lot of it has to do with the brain piece that we're discussing, what we now know. We just know some things we didn't know 50 years ago. And what we now know about the brain, the male brain, is that a boy's frontal lobes aren't fully developed until somewhere between the mid-20s and late 20s.
Wow.
So well past adolescence. And so if that's the case, and our frontal lobes are in charge of all those things we've been discussing, he could do a lot of damage to himself in adolescence. And so it's a part of where, when he is individuating, separating out, becoming his own person, finding his own voice, wanting to be away from us more, all that's normal. The tendency can be to give less and less oversight, and there to be less and less involvement. And it's as important a time he needs more oversight and more involvement in that season, really, than any other time. There's only so much damage that a 2-year-old can do to themselves, and we can still kind of just pick them right up, scoop them up. If they refuse to get in their car seat, we can still buckle them in. But, in adolescence, that's just not the case. And so I do talk a lot in the Wild Things book about what does it look like to give healthy oversight and supervision and involvement. In fact, I talk about in stage 3 of a boy's life, which is roughly 9 to 12, I say to parents, I want you to function like the Department of Homeland Security. I really do. I want you to be aware of all things, because the internet pornography piece is a great example. The data would tell us that used to say most boys have their first exposure between 11 and 14. The newest data would tell us 8 to 12. So if ever there were a window of time where we're going to have a lot more oversight, but I think that continues to be the case. But it's done alongside, I sound like I'm contradicting myself, but it's done alongside the letting out the rope. So it doesn't mean I'm in the car with you all the time, but it does mean I might be in the beginning when you're learning to drive and being responsible and making sure you get from where you are to where you're supposed to be, tracking with you in the beginning, and then looking at when I don't need to do that as much because you've been responsible with that.
I think it's really interesting thinking about the number of different perspectives here. So there could be a male, a father listening to this who is interacting with male and female children. There could be a mom listening to this and so the perspective is, how am I interpreting this from being a father to a son? So knowing that I am probably harder on him than I am on our daughters, and Joseph will point that out very quickly. And so me just recognizing that, I honestly, I don't think I've ever had that cognizant thought before. So that's really helpful. And then understanding, okay, if I'm a mother who may have more of a tendency to kind of helicopter around a son who's doing homework or whatever it is, yes, it's being there, but being there in the right way.
Yes.
And so I think I don't think it's a contradiction. I think we need to be creative in how we think about what that looks like. So I try to do an intentional job of just having fun with Joseph too, where it's like we're just out skiing or fly fishing or whatever it might be, but I don't necessarily do that with the girls yet. And so maybe there's just this creativity that we have to use, that yes, we need to recognize Department of Homeland Security for a period of time, and then there's probably the other stages that you explain in the book, but it's we need to be creative in exercising what that looks like in a healthy way. Letting the leash out the right way, I think, becomes really important for their long-term development.
I agree.
And maybe our ability to let go too.
I agree.
Okay, so this idea of respect, for some reason, I keep hearing about over and over again, and it was a foreign concept to me when I first I was talking with a friend, and she's like, she started telling her son that she respected him. I really respect the way that you handled that situation with your sister. And I was like, man, like I've never once said that to our son, because it's just not a natural phrase that I would necessarily think of. I would say, you're an awesome friend, or it was really wise how you navigate, whatever. Is that concept of respect a big deal to men?
It's a very big deal. And I'm glad you know that and you're thinking about that and the way you're thinking about it with your son. I do. And here's my theory on what that's about at the core. I think that competence is a top priority for us as men. Like it fascinates me. I don't know if you would agree with this or not, but it fascinates me the degrees that we'll go to, the decisions that we'll make to appear competent, to avoid looking incompetent in our world. And I think the same is true for boys, and that drives a lot of different things. But I think respect is so deeply connected to that, so that when you name that in the way you described, he feels competent in some way. I think that's in the mix. I think that's at the core. And so I don't think we can do much speaking to that. I really don't. I don't think we can do enough naming our sons as competent, and I think doing that through the vehicle of respect in a lot of ways.
All right. Any thoughts, Ben?
Yeah, it was interesting. When we were on vacation with our nephew. I was in the spa, and it was too hot for him to be in. But the jet that was coming out like at my feet was super hot, and so I felt the jet. So I like leaned down, and the water's like up to here, and I go, CJ, this jet is like really, really hot. And he he had no interest in getting in the spa, and then he reaches down like next to his foot. He's on dry land, and he reaches down next to his foot, and he's like, I can feel the jet. I can totally feel it.
Wow.
I mean, it's
Wow.
it's fascinating how simple maybe this is,
yes.
and we might be overcomplicating a lot of things, but recognizing that need to be confident. I couldn't agree more.
Mhm.
I think it's a big driver for me, and I know it's a big driver for me. Like there's a lot that I would like to do that I won't try to do because I feel like I don't want to look foolish. I don't want to look like I don't know what I'm doing. And the moment that we, I think, overcome that fear, so maybe just giving them that space to like, hey, this is your shot to don't worry about it at all. And I mean, it could be anything from, for me, I've discovered hunting and fishing in the last year and a half, and I have some really good mentors who have grown up doing that stuff. And I was an idiot when I first started. My fly line was a tangled mess like half the time that I was out there, but they gave me the freedom to say, this is your shot to learn it. Like, don't worry about screwing up the fish, right? Don't worry about that. We're not out here. Or John, my buddy, would be like, I've shot enough birds in my life. You don't need to worry about it. Like, this is for you. And so I think just creating that space where we can let go of that need to look and feel competent gives us, I think, some opportunities. So maybe it's a little bit different take on it, but for boys, just kind of allowing that to say, give them the respect because of who they are, not because of what they did or what they're doing, and allow them the space to try new things and not worry about looking foolish or not competent.
I agree. I think anytime, anytime we can call out his competence, call out his courage, I think even connects back to the first question, what we're seeing in our culture too. I think it speaks to healthy masculinity, like when he is courageous for good in this world, when he has purpose for good, when he is competent for good in this world. I think anytime we can do that, it just speaks to the heart of who he is and who he's becoming.
Okay, one simple question. What do the men in the world wish the women in the world knew?
It's a great question. You want to go first?
I think actually in this whole conversation, I think would lend to this sentiment, but I think we're a lot more simple than what women would believe us to be. Right. It's like there's nothing. Like it's nothing going on up there. So I think for women to understand that perhaps they're more complex in the thoughts, emotions, feelings, all of those sorts of things. And men, some of them will be, some of them are. And at maybe even different times, there are different times in my life where I have been more emotional, where I will, and I usually kind of conceal that, but there's usually not a whole lot more going on than what we would portray to everything. And so not to overcomplicate things by introducing kind of the degree that you... Yeah, it's just I think a little bit more simple than what most women would think it is.
I would agree with that. And I might add to that along those lines, I think giving us permission to need to use fewer words. In fact, it's fascinating if you were to look at, pediatricians have tracked at an 18-month and 24-month well visit the number of words that a girl will be using from the very beginning compared to the number of words that a boy will be using, and how that translates to our emotional vocabulary as well. It's not as expansive. It doesn't, and I talk about this in the new book, it doesn't mean we're less emotional, but it simply means the language or the words that we would put to that, the emotional vocabulary would not be as expansive. And that's harder for us in general at times to put words to, and I think to allow us to go at our pace. I would challenge women in that way, as wives, as mothers, to allow us to move at our pace. I won't assign that responsibility to you to be more male, and you won't assign it to me to be more female. And it's kind of back to where we started, was it looked like to be more for women and for men, and honoring the way we're hardwired.
Okay, David, last question. What's the best advice you never got?
It's a great question. I think even going back to the competence piece, I wish that I had grown up knowing or being told that every man feels incompetent. Even though we strive for competence, even though we'll go to great lengths to look competent, every man has a lot of moments in life where you just feel like, I have no idea what I'm doing. I'm completely making this up as I go along. And I think because we strive for competence in the way we do, men just love to come across like, I'm bringing my A game every time. I've got this down. And so therefore, I think it leaves a lot of boys throughout their growing up into adult manhood really feeling like everybody around me has got it going on, and I don't. So I wish I had been told that more all throughout growing up. Like, guess what? The guys around you, they don't know what they're doing. They look like they do, and they want to appear. Yes, here's the secret. And so I don't think we as men, I don't think with our boys can say that enough. I really don't think we can give them that permission to even say things like, in this exact moment, I feel scared to death. And I'm going to choose to be courageous, whatever the circumstance may be. But both are true, not just one. I'm not just choosing to be courageous. I feel frightened. And so I think that's an important conversation for us to be having with the boys we love.
Hey, thanks so much for listening. Make sure to subscribe so you don't miss an episode. Now go out and have more fun, and don't come back until you do.